Imagine, if you will, a young girl's scream tearing through the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle during a harsh winter's night in 1457. The sound slices through the howling gale with the chilling precision of a sharpened blade. Inside a chamber lit only by the dance of candlelight, a 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort clutches the blood-soaked linens beneath her, her small frame racked with a torment no child should ever have to bear. The midwives murmured desperate Latin prayers, their faces etched with dread in the flickering shadows. Beyond the castle walls, snow blankets the frozen earth of Bedfordshire. But within this room, the future King of England is being violently brought into the world by a mother who is little more than a child herself. Margaret of Bourbon's hair is plastered to her sweat-soaked face as another punishing wave of agony washes over her. They believe she is perishing. The infant is too large, her own hips far too narrow. At just 13, her body is still developing. Yet here she is, in a grueling labour, to deliver the son who would one day claim England's throne as Henry VII. The profound irony of the moment is not lost on anyone present. This child, born from such immense suffering, is destined to end the most savage conflict in English history and establish the Tudor dynasty that would forever alter the course of the world. Before we delve deeper into these forgotten tales of survival and anguish, if you are fascinated by the dark history that empires are built upon, please consider showing your support by hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this one. And do leave a comment below letting me know from where in the world you are tuning in. It's truly remarkable to think that we are exploring these ancient chronicles together from all corners of the globe, linked across centuries and continents by our shared fascination with the past. The girl fighting for her life in that bed was no ordinary noblewoman. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried the very blood of kings in her veins, descended directly from John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and the fourth son of King Edward III. However, this royal blood, as Margaret was to discover throughout her incredible life, was both a magnificent gift and a deadly curse in the merciless political arena of 15th century England, a time when the Wars of the Roses was about to rip the kingdom in two. A lineage like hers made you either an invaluable chess piece or a threat that had to be eliminated. Margaret's journey to that harrowing birthing chamber started many years before, when she was just a small child playing in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born around May of 1443 to John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she was born into a world where loyalties were as fleeting as desert sands, and marriage was the ultimate instrument of power. Her father passed away when she was barely a year old. Some whispered it was by his own hand, a spirit broken and shamed by military failures in France. Others murmured of poison, for in that age, such rumours trailed every unexpected noble death like shadows, a grim signature of this period's dark history. The murky circumstances of John Beaufort's demise cast a long shadow over Margaret's formative years. He had led English armies in France during the waning days of the 100 Years' War, forced to watch as the lands conquered by Henry V were lost one by one. These catastrophic defeats gnawed at his soul, and upon his return to England in 1444, members of the court remarked on his vacant eyes and shaking hands. He barely spoke, ate even less, and would spend countless hours staring into the void. On the 27th of May, 1444, he was discovered lifeless in his private rooms at Wimborne Minster. The official record cited a fever, but those who knew him best understood the deeper truth. Whether by steel, poison, or the crushing burden of his own failure, John Beaufort had chosen oblivion over disgrace. Margaret's mother did not hesitate to secure her young daughter's position. The Dowager Duchess, Margaret Beauchamp, knew the brutal calculus of survival in a world where women and children were commodities, their value measured only by the alliances they could forge. By the tender age of 6, young Margaret was promised to John de la Pole, the son of the immensely powerful William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. This contract was meant to unite two of England's most influential families in a bond that appeared unbreakable. But the winds of politics blew far faster than a child could grow, and when Suffolk was disgraced and ultimately assassinated while crossing the English Channel in 1450, that betrothal dissolved into worthless parchment. Suffolk's cardinal sin had been his role in negotiating the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, a union that came at the cost of surrendering Maine and Anjou to France, a concession that ignited fury among both the English nobility and the common folk. His end was savage, a grim chapter even by the brutal standards of that era's dark history. Seized from his vessel by either pirates or political foes, he was made to kneel upon the ship's edge as an assailant began their gruesome work, hacking at his neck with a rusted sword, a grim spectacle that took half a dozen clumsy strikes to complete. For the women of the Beaufort line, this was an early lesson. Survival demanded ruthless adaptability. Her next engagement was arranged with haste, binding her to Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, who was the half-brother of King Henry VI, through his mother's controversial marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were seen as Welsh newcomers with a dubious claim to their status, yet they possessed something far more valuable than an ancient lineage: the king's personal favour. Owen Tudor had started as a mere court official, who managed to capture the attention of Catherine of Valois, the widow of the great Henry V. Their clandestine marriage sent shockwaves of scandal through the ranks of the established nobility, yet it produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom King Henry VI officially recognised and raised to the peerage in the year 1455, at which time Margaret was only about 12 years of age. She was wed to Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that was less about love and more about sealing political alliances, using vows whose profound meaning she could scarcely comprehend, pledges that would chain her to a fate far beyond anything she could have imagined. The marriage ceremony was held at Bletsoe Castle, the very fortress that had been the backdrop of her entire childhood. Its great hall was adorned with grand tapestries, celebrating the heroic deeds of her Beaufort ancestors, while the very chapel where they spoke their vows held the tomb of her own grandfather, John Beaufort, the Earl of Somerset. Edmund Tudor, her new husband, was a man already in his 20s, a veteran hardened by the harsh realities of war and politics. In stark contrast, Margaret was a child still outgrowing her dresses. The marriage was consummated without delay. In an era where noble girls were viewed as little more than vessels for dynastic ambition, the concept of waiting for physical maturity simply did not exist. That wedding night was a profound trauma Margaret would never speak of, but the evidence of its brutal impact would be permanently etched upon her body and fuel a lifelong religious devotion that teetered on the edge of obsession. Merely months after her wedding, Margaret's body started to transform in ways that filled her young mind with terror. The older women of the court spoke of her condition in hushed whispers, their expressions a mixture of joy for a potential heir and grave concern for such a child mother. Margaret's own mother observed her daughter's swelling belly with profound anxiety, remembering she had been 18 when Margaret was born, an age mature enough to safely endure childbirth. At just 12, nearly 13, Margaret was facing an ordeal that had claimed the lives of countless women who were far older and stronger than she. But Edmund Tudor was destined never to see his child. In the autumn of 1456, while on a campaign in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The details surrounding his capture and ensuing death are shrouded in mystery, lost in the fog of civil war and the treacherous political intrigue that defined this chapter of dark history. Some reports claim he was taken in a surprise attack as his forces were spread thin across South Wales. Other accounts, however, hint at a more sinister cause: betrayal from within his own ranks. Whether he truly perished from plague in his cell or was quietly murdered by his captors remains one of the era's great unsolved mysteries. The official explanation of plague was certainly convenient for his captors, as disease was rampant in the squalid medieval prisons. Declaring a natural death was a simple way to avoid accusations of murdering the king's own half-brother. Yet, chroniclers of the time noted the suspicious swiftness of his decline and the pointed refusal of his jailers to permit any physicians to see him. What is certain is that by November of 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and completely alone in a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war. News of Edmund's demise finally reached Margaret at Lampay Palace in Pembrokeshire. She had been residing there while her husband was away on his campaign. The messenger appeared on a rain-lashed November evening, his horse slick with sweat from a frantic ride across the Welsh countryside. Margaret was inside the palace chapel, deep in prayer for her husband's safe return, when the sharp echo of the messenger's boots on the stone floor broke the silence behind her. Even before he uttered a single word, she knew her world had just been shattered. It was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who then took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. This was a move that was as much chivalrous as it was pragmatic. After all, Margaret was carrying the potential heir to the entire Tudor line, the very child who could secure their family's connection to the throne. He spirited her away to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where the colossal stone walls promised sanctuary from the escalating chaos beyond. Pembroke was a fortress at the very edge of the known world, perched upon cliffs above Milford Haven, where the Atlantic's relentless waves crashed against the rocks below. It was here, in this remote Welsh bastion, that Margaret would face the most harrowing ordeal of her young life, a defining moment in her own dark history. The journey to Pembroke, so advanced in her pregnancy, was a trial of endurance in itself. The winter roads were virtually impassable, rutted with frozen mud and obstructed by fallen trees. Margaret was conveyed in a horse-drawn litter, where each jarring bump sent spasms of pain through her swollen body. A journey that should have taken 2 days stretched into an agonizing 5. As they maneuvered around flooded rivers and evaded armed bands of men with uncertain loyalties, Pembroke Castle, in the dead of winter, revealed itself as a harsh refuge. Built upon a limestone outcrop high above the Pembroke River, the castle dominated the landscape for miles, its great circular keep soaring nearly 80 feet high. It had withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries, but its purpose was survival, not comfort. The castle's chambers were cold and perpetually draughty, warmed only by great fireplaces that devoured wood faster than the servants could possibly supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind that whistled through every single crack in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was particularly brutal. Ice formed on the inside of the castle windows, and the piercing sea wind howled through every fissure in the age-old stones. Margaret, her belly swollen with child, could scarcely walk the length of her chamber without becoming utterly exhausted. Her body, still in many ways that of a child, struggled beneath the tremendous burden it carried. The castle's physician, a learned man who had studied at the universities of Oxford and Paris, examined her with visibly growing alarm. Her hips were far too narrow, he confided to Jasper Tudor in a hushed tone. The child was positioned poorly. The birth would be dangerous, perhaps even fatal. Dr. Louis Carlion was a man who had delivered children for queens and peasants alike. He had studied the ancient texts of Hippocrates and Galen, attended lectures by the greatest medical minds of his generation, and amassed 40 years of experience in the healing arts. But as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his learning felt woefully inadequate. Margaret's pelvis had not yet fully developed. She herself was still growing. The baby within her womb was large, positioned incorrectly, and was already showing signs of distress. He confided his deepest fears to Jasper Tudor during a private meeting in the castle's solar. Snow swirled outside the arrow-slit windows as the 2 men discussed Margaret's fate in grave whispers. Carlion was blunt. He had encountered this situation before, and it rarely ended well for either the mother or the child. They could attempt to turn the baby, but that procedure might kill both patients instantly. They could try to wait, hoping nature would correct the position, but any delay increased the risk of the child's death and Margaret's complete exhaustion. Or they could attempt a cesarean birth, a procedure that, in the dark history of medicine, was almost invariably a death sentence for the mother. Jasper Tudor, barely 25 years old himself, faced the terrible burden of deciding the fate of his sister-in-law. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would end with him, a younger son with no legitimate heirs of his own. If she lived but the child was lost, the same devastating result would follow. The political implications weighed on him heavily, but so did a genuine personal affection. He had grown quite fond of the brave, intelligent girl who had faced her widowhood with such profound dignity. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed a maturity that belied her tender years. She spent her time learning everything she possibly could about politics and statecraft, understanding with a sharp, intuitive sense that knowledge would be her greatest weapon in the struggles to come. Jasper Tudor, impressed by her intelligence and determination, became her mentor in the brutal arts of survival, a necessary education in this era of dark history. He taught her to read the truth in people's faces, to hear the unspoken messages hidden behind diplomatic language, and to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that govern the whole of noble society. Margaret also threw herself into religious study with an intensity that began to worry her attendants. She would spend countless hours in the castle chapel, praying so fervently before the altar that the cold stone left her knees raw and bleeding. She immersed herself in memorizing Latin prayers and studying theological texts, forging a profound connection with God that would become her anchor through decades of political turmoil. Some historians believe her intense piety was born from a need to cope with the trauma of her child marriage, a grim chapter in her own dark history, and the terrifying prospect of motherhood, a desperate attempt to find meaning in suffering that felt utterly senseless. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, also became a pivotal figure in Margaret's education. He was a Welshman, educated at Cambridge before he took his holy vows. He possessed a rare understanding of both classical university learning and the brutal politics of survival, teaching Margaret that God often required human hands to do his work. He instilled in her the belief that prayer without action was hollow, but that action guided by faith could move mountains. Then came that fateful January night in the year 1457. The first pains of labour seized Margaret with such force they doubled her over. She had been walking the cold castle battlements, following Dr. Carlion's insistence on exercise for her health. It was there that the first contraction struck, unleashing a pain unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was a crushing, tearing force that felt as if it were splitting her very body in two. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping for air as her ladies-in-waiting hurried her back to her chambers. The midwives, seasoned women who had attended countless births, shared a silent, heavy glance. This was a familiar scene from the dark history of noble houses, a child's body forced to give birth to another child. It was nature, twisted beyond its limits by raw ambition and political calculus. They readied their instruments and whispered their prayers, fully aware that before the sun rose, one or both of their patients could be lost. The head midwife, Dame Gwenllian Virch Dafydd, was a woman who had spent 30 years bringing life into the world. Her craft learned from her mother and grandmother before her. She was the keeper of secrets, passed down through generations of Welsh women knowledge of herbs that could soothe agony and techniques to turn a baby in the womb, and ancient prayers that seemed to lend impossible strength to mothers in labour. But as she examined young Margaret, her weathered face hardened with grim certainty. The other midwives began laying out their instruments with a grim efficiency. There were knives not just for the umbilical cord, but for procedures too horrifying to name. There were cruel-looking hooks and forceps, potions to revive a failing mother, and holy relics for when all earthly hope was gone. Soon, the chamber was thick with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, and other secret plants known only to the women, who stood at the threshold of both birth and death. For 18 agonizing hours, Margaret's torment defied all description, her screams echoing from the cold stone walls. Her voice eventually failed, replaced by the raw, gasping sounds of pure suffering. Through it all, the midwives worked with frantic desperation. Their hands, slick with blood, fought to save both mother and child, as Dame Gwenllian deployed every skill in her considerable arsenal. She used massage, repositioning, herbal remedies, and a constant stream of encouragement whispered into Margaret's ear. Just outside, Jasper Tudor paced the stone corridors. The sharp click of his boots on the flagstones was the only sound, each step a reminder that the entire future of the Lancastrian cause could be extinguished in that very room. He could hear her screams even through the heavy oak door, each cry a blade twisting in his gut. Servants scurried by with basins of steaming water and armfuls of fresh linen, their faces masks of dread. Elsewhere, in the quiet of the chapel, Father Meredith knelt. He prayed without pause for the young girl whose life now hung by the most fragile of threads. As the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, Margaret's strength began to ebb away. After nearly a full day of labour, her small, young body had been pushed beyond all endurance. Dr. Carlion, roused from a fitful sleep, was summoned. He examined her quickly, his urgent whispers with Dame Gwenllian painting a dire picture. The baby was alive, but its heartbeat was faint and erratic. Margaret was bleeding internally. Her pulse was a mere flutter, and her skin had turned the pale white of parchment. The terrible decision was made. They would have to attempt a manual extraction, a perilous intervention, one that might claim the mother's life to save the child's. Dame Gwenllian was no stranger to this grim procedure, yet she had never attempted it on a frame so young and fragile. She positioned Margaret with utmost care, whispering a silent prayer to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, as she readied herself to reach into the girl's body and manually guide the infant into existence. When the child was at last delivered, wrenched from Margaret's womb in an ordeal that brought her to the brink of death, the midwives collectively held their breath. The newborn was pallid and scarcely breathing, slick with blood and the fluids of birth. For a heart-stopping moment, an unnerving silence filled the chamber, broken only by Margaret's ragged breaths and the fire's crackle. Then, with practiced hands, Dame Gwenllian cleared the infant's mouth and throat, and a sound that would alter destiny pierced the air. A thin, furious wail, heralding the arrival of Henry Tudor, the future King of England. Barely conscious, her young body utterly broken by the trial, Margaret heard her son's first cry through a dense fog of pain and exhaustion. She willed herself to reach for him, but her limbs refused to obey. Dame Gwenllian gently laid the baby upon Margaret's chest for a fleeting moment, a customary first meeting, before whisking him to the warmth of the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes tracked the infant with a desperate, burning intensity, searing every feature of his tiny face into her memory. The toll on Margaret's body was grievous and irreversible. Dr. Carl Leon, upon examining her in the days that followed, discovered widespread tearing and internal damage that would plague her for life. The physician spoke in hushed tones of ravaged flesh and ruined organs, and of a blood loss so severe it had nearly been fatal. She would never carry another child. This one brutal birth had sealed her reproductive fate. A chapter of her life closed before it truly began. At just 13, she was rendered barren, a grim entry in the dark history of women sacrificed for dynastic ambition. Her physical recovery was tortuously slow. For weeks, Margaret languished in the space between life and death, tormented by fever and rampant infection. Dr. Collion employed every remedy from his considerable arsenal, bloodletting, to balance her humours and herbal poultices, to combat the festering sickness. He prescribed potent wines laced with medicinal herbs to rebuild her strength, while the steadfast Dame Gwenllian remained a constant presence at her side, spooning broth past Margaret's cracked lips and watching for any change in her fragile state. Yet, her psychological healing would prove a far more difficult journey. The deep trauma of her ordeal surfaced in harrowing nightmares, leaving her screaming and weeping in the dead of night. An intense fear of physical contact took hold. She would flinch from even the kindest touch of her attendants. Consequently, her bond with her newborn son grew complicated, his very presence a reminder of her agony. She adored him with a fierce desperation, yet could scarcely hold him without being consumed by flashbacks of his violent entry into the world. But while Margaret Beaufort's body was shattered, her spirit remained unbroken. As she slowly mended in the months after Henry's birth, she started to reveal the indomitable will and sharp, calculating mind that would forge her into one of the most formidable women in all of English history. She knew, even in her depleted state, that her son was the last, best hope for the Lancastrian cause. She also knew that a landless widow with an infant son required a powerful protector in a realm descending into chaos. All around them, the Wars of the Roses were igniting with escalating violence, a bloody new chapter in the nation's dark history. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had declared that England's dynastic quarrels would be settled not with words, but with sword and axe. The White Rose of York now stood against the Red Rose of Lancaster in a brutal conflict that would devour England's nobility for 3 long decades. Richard, Duke of York, laid his claim to the throne, arguing his descent from Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians defended their crown through their lineage from Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt. Margaret, with Lancastrian blood flowing through her Beaufort veins, was now inextricably tied to a cause that was rapidly losing ground. The reigning Lancastrian king, King Henry VI, was seen by many as feeble, perhaps even mad, and utterly unfit to govern. His queen, the formidable Margaret of Anjou, was far more competent, but also deeply despised. A foreign queen held responsible for England's humiliating military failures in France and the nation's descent into civil war, a grim chapter in its dark history. Her solution, once again, was a strategic marriage in 1458. Still fragile from the birth of her son Henry, she was wed to Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. The ceremony was a subdued event, a stark contrast to the grand spectacle of her marriage to Edmund Tudor. Margaret remained physically weak, still in mourning, while her new husband was a stranger, selected for his political value, not for love. Stafford himself was a known sympathizer of the Yorkist cause, but crucially, he was a pragmatist who recognized that safeguarding Margaret also meant preserving the invaluable Beaufort estates and lineage. For Margaret, this union was a shield for herself and her son, even if it required sharing her life with a man whose political allegiances were in direct opposition to her most profound beliefs. This arrangement was less a romantic union and more a calculated business partnership, a pragmatic answer to pressing dangers. The marriage contract, which was negotiated by Margaret's mother and Stafford's father, was meticulously detailed, a testament to the treacherous political landscape. It stipulated that Margaret would keep full control of her Beaufort lands, guaranteeing her son's inheritance was secure. In return, Stafford would offer military protection and provide political cover for the family's Lancastrian loyalties. Critically, it ensured young Henry Tudor would stay under the guardianship of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, in Wales, a clause that almost certainly saved his life. This marriage to Stafford endured for 14 years, spanning one of the most brutal periods of England's dark history. From the sidelines, Margaret observed as the tides of war ebbed and flowed violently across the English countryside. Kings were made and unmade with breathtaking speed. Henry VI was dethroned. Edward IV was crowned. Then Henry VI was restored, only for Edward IV to triumph once more. Every shift of the crown unleashed fresh perils for anyone with uncertain allegiances or a precious bloodline. Margaret learned to navigate the treacherous political currents with increasing skill. She cultivated relationships with influential women on both sides of the conflict, understanding that these female networks often outlasted the fragile alliances forged by men. She maintained regular correspondence with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen of Edward IV, all while keeping a secret line of communication open with Margaret of Anjou in her French exile. These delicate relationships demanded exceptional diplomatic finesse, as a single misplaced word could easily lead to accusations of treason. Throughout these turbulent years, Margaret's son, Henry, was kept safe in Wales under the watchful eye of Jasper Tudor. While the arrangement was a practical necessity, it was utterly heartbreaking for Margaret. She saw her only child perhaps once or twice a year, and even then, only under meticulously negotiated circumstances. Henry grew from a baby into a boy, and then a young man, essentially a stranger to his own mother, raised in the rugged Welsh hills by his uncle, while she navigated the deadly currents of English court politics. This separation, though necessary for his survival, was a source of constant agony. Margaret channeled her thwarted maternal love into letters filled with carefully coded messages that could safely pass through enemy territory without exposing compromising information. She sent gifts when she could, precious books, new clothes, and small keepsakes that might remind Henry of the mother he hardly knew. But for the most part, she lived in a perpetual state of profound anxiety, never certain if her son was safe, in good health, or even still alive. Meanwhile, Henry's education in Wales was both thorough and practical. Jasper Tudor made sure his nephew mastered not only the expected noble pursuits horsemanship, swordsmanship, music, and dance, but also the much harder skills required for survival. Henry learned to speak the Welsh language fluently, to grasp the rhythms of country life, and to earn the loyalty of men who owed him nothing but their respect. These were lessons that would prove to be priceless when he eventually returned to claim his throne. Margaret's own political education, meanwhile, continued throughout her marriage to Stafford. She mastered the art of managing vast estates, deciphering financial ledgers, and navigating the intricate web of obligations that bound medieval society together. She delved into law, history, and theology with the relentless intensity of a university scholar. Her personal library expanded to become one of England's most impressive private collections, filled with manuscripts in Latin, French, and English, on topics spanning from military tactics to mystical theology. In the year 1461, her world was shattered once more. Edward IV claimed a savage victory at the Battle of Towton, an event seared into England's dark history as the bloodiest clash on its soil. An estimated 50,000 men converged on a snow-covered field in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461. By dusk, nearly half of them lay dead. The Lancastrian cause was left in utter ruin, its leadership either slaughtered or scattered to the winds. Henry VI sought refuge in Scotland, while Margaret of Anjou sailed for France with her young son, Edward of Westminster. The bloody aftermath of Towton thrust Margaret into a new and perilous existence. Her Lancastrian bloodline made her an immediate object of suspicion in Edward IV's court, though her marriage to Stafford provided a fragile shield. Even more dangerously, her infant son, hidden away in Wales, stood as a potential figurehead for any renewed Lancastrian resistance. Edward IV had already proven his readiness to execute his rivals. Would that merciless policy be extended to a child? Margaret endured sleepless nights, tormented by the fear that soldiers would be sent for Henry, that she might wake one day to news of her son's death. To survive this chapter of England's dark history, she constructed an elaborate intelligence network, paying servants and merchants for whispers from Wales and bribing clerks for copies of royal correspondence, doing everything imaginable to stay one step ahead of the ever-present threats. The constant vigilance was utterly exhausting, but it was the price of her son's life. In 1469, Henry Stafford was gravely wounded, fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Edgecote. The injury, a deep gash in his thigh that became horribly infected, left him partially disabled and increasingly embittered by his service to the Yorkist cause. He had risked his very life for Edward IV, yet he received little in the way of recognition or reward. The disappointment festered within him, making him susceptible to Margaret's subtle and calculated influence. As Margaret nursed her husband through months of agonizing recovery, she used the time to methodically erode his political loyalties. She never openly advocated for the Lancastrian cause, as that would have been far too dangerous. Instead, she played a more insidious game, planting seeds of doubt about Edward IV's leadership, sharing carefully chosen stories of Yorkist corruption and ineptitude, and gradually persuading Stafford that his loyal service had been shamefully unrewarded. The process demanded extraordinary psychological cunning, as Margaret had to overcome years of Yorkist allegiance, his personal gratitude for Edward IV's earlier mercy, and Stafford's own cautious disposition. She accomplished it through patience, relentless repetition, and the masterful manipulation of his wounded pride. By 1478, as the Earl of Warwick's rebellion against Edward IV began to take shape, Stafford was ready to betray his king. In 1470, the political kaleidoscope had shifted violently once again. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the formidable noble known as the Kingmaker, had a spectacular falling out with Edward IV and forged an alliance with Margaret of Anjou to return Henry VI to the throne. The alliance was shocking. Warwick was the very man who had placed Edward IV on the throne in the first place and had fought against Henry VI for years. But the dark history of this war created the strangest of bedfellows, and Warwick's wounded pride triumphed over his former loyalties. Margaret observed these events with a burning intensity and a burgeoning sense of hope. If Henry VI could be restored, if the Lancastrian cause could finally prevail, then perhaps her son could finally emerge from his Welsh exile. She began to cautiously contact other Lancastrian sympathizers, testing the political waters for a potential uprising. These secret communications were extraordinarily risky. Discovery would mean certain death for everyone involved. The restoration of Henry VI in October of 1478 seemed like a divine miracle to Margaret. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, his brother Richard of Gloucester at his side. As Henry VI was escorted from the Tower of London to be formally reinstated upon his throne, the tragically unstable king appeared utterly bewildered by the sudden reversal of fortune. He was a man lost, unable to grasp how he had transitioned from captive to king in the span of a night. Margaret, present at his restoration in Westminster, witnessed the full extent of his decline. She saw with her own eyes just how frail and disoriented the Lancastrian monarch had truly become. But this fragile restoration was doomed to be fleeting. Edward IV soon returned. He stormed back from exile in March of 1471, backed by Burgundian funds and leading a small, brutal army of seasoned mercenaries. He moved with lightning speed, rallying support from nobles. These were men who had grown weary of the endless chaos and instability. The final, bloody showdown occurred at Barnet on April the 14th, 1471, where the mighty Warwick fell in the heat of battle. Merely 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury, on May the 4th, 1471, the Lancastrian dream was extinguished for all time. In that single year, the world turned upside down. The Battle of Tewkesbury marked the ultimate crushing of the Lancastrian cause and claimed the life of Edward, Prince of Wales, the very last direct heir to Henry VI's throne. Official reports claimed the prince died in the chaos of the fight, yet darker whispers suggested he was brutally cut down after his capture. His demise, followed by the highly suspicious death of King Henry VI himself, annihilated the direct Lancastrian line, a truly grim chapter in England's dark history. All at once, Margaret's teenage son was transformed into the most credible claimant for the Lancastrian succession, and by extension, one of the most endangered individuals in all of England. His claim to the throne was both convoluted and remote, tracing back through the Beaufort line, a lineage perpetually clouded by questions of legitimacy that had been seeded generations before. Yet, with no direct Lancastrian heirs left standing, Henry Tudor's claim began to carry immense weight for all those who stood against the Yorkist regime. Jasper Tudor, acutely aware of the mortal peril his nephew was in, made a decision born of pure desperation. He would spirit the boy away into exile. It was the only way to avoid capture and what would have been an almost certain execution. The choice was agonizing but essential, for to remain in Wales was to accept a death sentence. Yet exile meant forsaking everything and everyone Henry had ever known. And so, on a tempestuous night in September of 1471, a 14-year-old Henry Tudor stepped onto a ship in Tenby and sailed into what would become 14 long years of exile in Brittany. The escape was frantic and fraught with peril. Yorkist soldiers were tightening their grip on the final Lancastrian footholds in Wales. Henry and Jasper had barely an hour's notice before enemy troops descended upon Pembroke Castle. Margaret was nowhere near to witness her son's departure. She was in England, completely oblivious to the fact her child was fleeing for his very life, until the news finally reached her days later. The shock was a devastating blow. For 14 years, the breadth of Wales had kept her from Henry. Now, the vast English Channel stood between them, that and the animosity of entire nations. She could not possibly know if she would ever lay eyes on him again, picturing herself standing on the Welsh cliffs. In her mind's eye, the wind tore at her cloak as Margaret confronted the harrowing possibility that she had just lost all that she held dear. Her son was gone, perhaps forever. Her cause lay in ruins, its champions either dead or scattered to the winds. Her own standing, too, was becoming more treacherous by the day. This was a time when Edward IV was cementing his victory, a bloody process that involved settling old scores with his adversaries. Margaret returned to England and to her marriage with Henry Stafford. She returned with a heart that had hardened into something far more resilient than steel. If she was to be denied the role of a mother, then she would become something else entirely. She would become a master strategist, a survivor, a woman who would dedicate the remainder of her life to navigating the treacherous currents of England's dark history, to place her exiled son upon the throne. The profound grief of their separation was forged into a cold and calculating ambition. Her metamorphosis was nothing short of astonishing to behold. Courtiers who remembered Margaret as a quiet and pious young lady were now confronted by a formidable political force who appeared to anticipate every move on the great chessboard of power. She began to meticulously weave networks of support across England, covertly identifying nobles who could be swayed to back her son's eventual return. This clandestine work was perilous and draining, but it gave her a singular, unwavering purpose. Then, Henry Stafford died in 1471, not long after Henry's exile had begun. To keen observers, the timing was deeply suspicious. While Stafford had suffered from poor health since his war injury, his death arrived at a moment of extraordinary convenience, adding another layer of intrigue to this era's dark history. Regarding Margaret's political schemes, whether his death was from natural causes, poison, or sheer stress, remains a historical mystery. His passing, however, liberated Margaret to pursue her ambitions more boldly. Now approaching 30 and twice a widow, she faced a momentous decision about her third marriage. She could have embraced a life of safety by marrying a minor nobleman who would protect her estates and leave her to mourn her lost son in peace. Instead, she chose power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most politically astute noblemen in all of England. Stanley was a grandmaster of the perilous game that had consumed so many others. He specialized in siding with the victor at the last conceivable moment, shifting his loyalties with such flawless timing that he always emerged on the right side of any conflict. His family commanded considerable military forces in northwest England, and his political tendrils reached into every layer of society, from the royal court to the merchant guilds. For Margaret, an alliance with Stanley meant gaining access to intelligence networks, political leverage, and military resources that could one day prove decisive for her son's cause. For Stanley, marrying Margaret brought him the prestige of the Beaufort bloodline and her far-reaching connections among the nobility. Their marriage was a partnership of convenience, but it proved to be remarkably potent. The wedding ceremony was an elaborate spectacle by the standards of the era, designed to broadcast Margaret's continued relevance despite her son's exile. The festivities spanned 3 days, complete with tournaments, lavish banquets, and religious ceremonies that drew nobles from across the realm. King Edward IV himself was in attendance, perhaps calculating that it was better to have the dangerous Margaret Beaufort under his watch than to have her operating from the shadows. The marriage contract was complex and meticulously negotiated. Margaret retained full control of her Beaufort lands and the explicit right to advance her son's interests. Stanley, in turn, gained a wife whose sharp intellect and connections were a perfect match for his own political cunning. Both understood their partnership was founded on mutual advantage rather than romantic love, a pragmatic arrangement to navigate the challenges they faced together. They skillfully steered through the treacherous final years of Edward IV's reign, surviving the purges and political tempests that destroyed many of their contemporaries. Margaret exploited her position as Stanley's wife to gather intelligence on royal policy and to maintain clandestine communications with exiles and potential supporters. Stanley provided the perfect cover for her activities, all while fortifying his own power base for whatever conflicts lay on the horizon. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor was coming of age in exile. The Duchy of Brittany was technically independent, governed by Duke Francis II, but it was caught in a vice between the competing pressures of France and England. Henry's position there was exceptionally precarious. He was valuable as a potential ally or a bargaining chip, but also dangerous as a rallying point for English opposition to Edward IV. This period of dark history saw letters between mother and son become increasingly infrequent and painstakingly coded as the years passed. They employed false names, invisible inks, and elaborate ciphers to communicate. Messages were concealed within seemingly innocent correspondence about commerce or family matters. The system was cumbersome and inherently unreliable, but it preserved the crucial link between Margaret's intelligence network in England and Henry's court in exile. Margaret lived with a perpetual fear that her son was dead, either dispatched by Yorkist assassins or simply claimed by disease or accident in a foreign land. The agonizing uncertainty was perhaps a worse fate than a definitive tragedy would have been. In response, she cultivated an elaborate system of informants who brought her fragments of news from Brittany: merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, anyone who had seen her son or heard of his welfare. The intelligence network Margaret constructed was extraordinary in its scale and sophistication, a secret chapter in England's dark history. She had informants in royal palaces, merchant guilds, monastic orders, and noble households throughout England and across the continent. Information flowed to her through a web of secret communications that would have impressed professional spy masters. She knew of troop movements before some commanders did, heard court gossip before it reached the king's ears, and meticulously monitored the health and loyalties of potential allies and foes. Edward IV's life came to an abrupt end in April of 1483, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir to the throne. The king's passing was sudden, though not entirely a shock. He had lived a life of excess, indulging in food and drink, and his health had been failing for years. However, his death at the age of 40 plunged the kingdom into immediate chaos. A child king required a regency, a power structure that could easily twist into a dictatorship, but this boy king was fated never to be crowned. In a move that would define this chapter of England's dark history, his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup that shocked even the realm's most violence-hardened nobles. Young Edward V and his brother Richard were escorted into the Tower of London, vanishing behind its walls, never to be seen alive again. Richard III was crowned king in July of 1483, but his reign was born under a cloud of suspicion that would forever darken his legacy. For Margaret, this usurpation presented both a terrible danger and an unprecedented opportunity. Richard's seizure of power had utterly shattered the legitimacy of the House of York. Suddenly, Henry Tudor's once distant claim through the Beaufort line began to appear as a viable alternative to a king widely suspected of being a child murderer. With breathtaking audacity, Margaret began to plot. Working through a network of contacts like Bishop John Morton and other exiles, she coordinated a rebellion inside England, while simultaneously arranging for her son to invade from Brittany. The conspiracy was a monumental undertaking, demanding perfect timing, extensive financing, and secure communications across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The rebellion collapsed in October of 1483, when a betrayal exposed Henry's planned invasion. Margaret could only watch in horror as her co-conspirators were rounded up and executed. She escaped death solely because of her marriage to Stanley, but she was placed under house arrest and stripped of all her titles. Yet, Margaret was not defeated. Even as a prisoner in her own home, she continued her secret, plotting through coded letters and trusted servants, spending months planning not just for her son's return, but for his successful reign as king. When Henry finally invaded at Milford Haven in August of 1485, Margaret's patient cultivation of the Stanley family was about to pay its ultimate dividend. At Bosworth Field on August 27, 1485, Richard III died fighting in the mud of Leicestershire. The Stanley forces, positioned to support Richard, instead turned against him in a stunning betrayal that Margaret herself had orchestrated through years of careful manipulation. After 28 years of separation, 14 years of exile, and decades of patient planning, her son was now King of England. Henry VII had triumphed, and in that victory, Margaret became the most powerful woman in the entire kingdom. However, she would never again enjoy the simple relationship of a mother and child, a bond stolen from her by the cruel demands of political necessity. Margaret lived to see her son establish the Tudor dynasty, marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, and father the prince who would become Henry VIII. She passed away in 1509, just days after her grandson's coronation, having completed a life's arc of ambition that began in the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle. The cost of Margaret's success, a grim chapter in England's dark history, cannot be calculated in simple terms. She sacrificed her body to give England a king, her motherhood to the altar of political necessity, and her personal happiness to the pursuit of dynastic ambition. The 13-year-old girl screaming in labour at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the formidable woman she would become, the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, and the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses by transmuting the raw power of maternal love into political gold. In Westminster Abbey, where Margaret Beaufort lies in her tomb of black marble, visitors can read the Latin inscription that summarises a life of extraordinary achievement built upon a foundation of extraordinary sacrifice. But they cannot hear the echoes of that long-ago scream, a chilling sound from England's dark history, the cry of a child in agony, bringing forth the future of a nation. That sound, and the story it began, remains buried within the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs, and the wind still howls through the ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through a crucible of suffering that no child should ever have to endure.